So this weekend, Sony dropped Madam Web, which is, supposedly set in this larger Sony Spider-Man universe. But this movie is so sort of embarrassed by itself that it doesn't allow itself to be. And for that, it kind of earns my respect. Now, hear me out. If Sony had taken, the route they were originally going to be taking and try to create this cinematic universe within its own realm of Marvel, separate from Marvel Studios, but still with like an inch of like door space to kind of like crawl in, this would not be good. This would not fit anything that Marvel Studios is doing. It's not even really fitting anything that the Sony verse is doing, with the Spider-Verse movies, even the Venom films. The closest this comes to anything is Morbius, which is, makes sense because this is from the same writers of that same film, But with all of that being said, surprisingly, I had a blast watching this movie. Now, when I was younger and going to school for film, I used to take things a lot more personally. If I saw a movie that I thought was just outright bad, it would affect me like for days. And I know that's the case with a lot of people, especially when it comes to these superhero movies where there's a built-in fan base and people really want to see these characters that they love so much represented on screen, respectfully. And it seems like with Madam Web, they took a kind of the general idea of what that character is in the comics and was like, screw it. Let's just do whatever we want to do. And that takes a lot of balls, Sony. That takes a lot of gall. And, you could say what you want about the film. It's not good. Like, I will admit that. Like, from beginning to end, there really are no legitimate cinematic redeeming qualities about this movie. But I saw a review of this that kind of compared it to the movie Cats, and I don't know about you, but Cats is one of my favorite films. And I'm not saying that it's a good movie. It's just weird. It exists in its own world, not just in the context of the story, but in the world of filmmaking as a whole. Both of these films are based on pre-existing properties, and both films also take huge artistic liberties. And I use the word artistic in quotation marks here, because it also feels like both of these movies, the dialogue was written by like ChatGPT or something like that. But I think that's the charm. That's kind of the charm, and I'm not advocating for this. I'm not advocating that you leave your house right now and buy a ticket for Madam Web. Please save your money unless you are a fan of Schlock. Madam Web, the movie, takes place in 2003. It feels like this movie was made in 2003. This was in the early days of the comic book film, We had a few stellar examples with X-Men and, the first Spider-Man at that point. But everything else that tried to do what they were doing ultimately fell short. It was kind of a challenge of how do we translate this comic book into a feature-length film that people, are going to be engaged with, that people going to want more of. And they really used to play it safe, at least for those first films. If they were even granted a sequel, maybe their only film, The film itself is very simple and yet extremely convoluted at the same time. And I think that, to me, is actually kind of charming. It's like, oh, that's cute. You're trying something here, but you're not. And look, I'm going to give the filmmakers a bit of grace here. They're under this direction of, the studio and, the woman who's in charge. What's her name? Amy Pascal. And she's kind of notorious for just taking an idea and not really executing it that well. There was even this, I remember there was this infamous interview where she just outright said that her films were connected to the MCU with Kevin Feige sitting right next to her. And the look on his face just said everything.
And they will be connected to each other as well. So there is a chance that Tom Holland as Spider-Man will pop up somewhere over there. There's always a chance.
And all of these Sony Marvel movies have totally been half-ass in their execution. You look at the Venom films. Venom is a character that really should not exist without Spider-Man. However, he got his own film first. He actually got 2 movies. And at the end of the second one, they pulled a stunt to connect it to that overall MCU. And when we got the payoff in No Way Home during the post-credits, it kind of just retconned itself right away. So I don't really know if they have a game plan at all. At least Kevin Feige has something tangible. You know, it doesn't always work, especially with Disney requesting just this constant barrage of Marvel properties. I think I read recently that they're going to start scaling down because there's such an oversaturation. Call it the YouTube-ification of Disney. You know, more, and quality getting less. It happens. It happens to the best of creators. You know, when you build a empire, so to speak, and you have a bunch of mouths to feed. You have a bunch of employees now. You've taken what was charming to begin with and kind of niche. Marvel, you know, back in the early days, that was kind of like scheduled to fail. You know, like, what is a comic book movie? All the examples prior to X-Men, you know, with the exception of maybe, you know, the Tim Burton Batman movies and the Superman films, didn't really do too hot. And it was all those other examples, you know, films I can think of, like the 1994 Fantastic Four film or Daredevil 2003. Sure, those movies are bad by a lot of different variables that you can, you know, take into consideration. But they're also kind of fun to watch for all the wrong reasons, of course. And that brings me back to why I had such an amazing time watching Madam Web. So I'm going to talk about this in 3 parts based on a 3-act structure because I actually felt like I was watching 3 different movies because I felt so many emotions out of this film. And kudos to you, because there are some like Oscar-nominated films out there that probably would not elicit enough emotion out of me as this one did. So let's just talk about the first third, and I'm gonna call this the schlock. This is when the film is at its best. So the movie peaks at the beginning, but it's also arguably the worst at the beginning. It opens up in the jungles of Peru. There's a scientist out there who's trying to, you know, locate this spider that she's been seeking for, like, you know, long time. And her partner pretty much, you know, backstabs her. Really, no, honestly, not even backstabs, just shoots her right in the chest. And I didn't mention that this scientist is a pregnant woman who is, you know, very close to term. At first I was like, why the hell is this pregnant woman out in the jungles? She's about to pop. But they do, I will give them credit, they do explain that later on. Immediately after she's shot, there are these just absurd shots of these spider people who kind of look like a mix between Spider-Man and Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. And they take her into a cave where they inject her with this spider venom that supposedly is going to either save her and her baby or just the baby. And it turns out that it saves just the baby, who grows up to be, you know, Cassandra Webb, Madam Web. Now, to talk about this scene without showing visual representation, because, you know, the movie just came out, is kind of doing a disservice to it. I have to tell you, the editing in this film is abysmal. And this is coming from someone who has been a professional editor for quite some time now. And to me, it was so fun to watch. Just the close-up shots of all these like spider people running through the trees. The main villain's voice constantly seems like it's out of place, like it's 80 yard, and never really truly matches how his demeanor is. There's some scenes where his lips straight up don't match what's being said at all. And same thing goes for like the leader of these spider people. Like if you see this movie, keep an eye on the dude's lips while he's talking. It looks like that scene from Kung Pao. You know the one I'm talking about?
Hey, who's he?
I don't know.
Anyway, you know, this is like 5 minutes into the movie. I'm already just excited. I'm like, this is next level bad movie. I'm going to have a blast. I love good, bad films. And it does proceed to go that way. The dialogue in this film, it's almost like they took an outline for the movie and used it as the shooting script. And I wouldn't be surprised if ChatGPT or some sort of other AI tool was used to create some of the dialogue. It's so base level. It's very much, this is what I'm doing. I'm talking about it in the most concise way possible. And that doesn't lead for a lot of character depth at all. Earlier in the video, I said the thing about, you know, Sony probably being a little hesitant now after seeing the film to try to connect it to Spider-Man. And that's very evident. Cassandra Webb, you know, Dakota Johnson's character, she is a paramedic. And her partner on the team is Ben Parker. So if you know Marvel lore, you know that that's Uncle Ben from the Spider-Man series. Like, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. The whole reason why Spider-Man exists. And they don't do anything with that at all. There's a whole bit, and this scene is one of my favorite scenes in the film, where they're having some banter together, and Ben mentions that he started seeing this girl, and Cassandra asks like, "Ooh, what's her name?" And then he just remains silent, and then she's like, "Oh, so it's serious, huh?" And he still remains silent. And then it cuts back to her and she's silent. And then it cuts back to him and he's silent. And then it cuts back to her and she's silent. And then it cuts back to him and he's silent. And then the conversation continues. We never learn what his girlfriend's name is. Obviously, they were building up this like reveal maybe later on in the movie that this was going to be Aunt May. Not maybe, for sure gonna be Aunt May. And they never bring it up again. Eventually we catch up with the villain from the beginning of the movie that killed Cassandra Webb's mom. And he's like in bed with some lady and he wakes up from a nightmare where he sees these 3 spider women breaking into his home when he's older and murdering him, you know, throwing him off a building. And these shots of the Spider Women are what we see in the trailer, you know, the shots of them coming down, swinging in, you know. And for me in that moment, I was like, oh, so y'all are just showing us the end of the movie now because you know audiences are gonna get restless waiting for these Spider Women to show up. And it never happens. Spoiler alert, you know, this review is not going to be totally linear. I'm going to be hopping back and forth. We never get that at all. The girls never grow up to be the Spider Women in this movie. And that scene seemed to just be put there for the trailer. So now we have this whole entire plot of him seeking out these girls to kill them before they kill him. And that's not even how he dies at the end of the movie. It's very insulting for a lot of reasons, but at the same time, I have to give them some credit for just not giving an F about the audience and just trying to capitalize on this whole image of, ooh, it's the Spider Women, you know? We just saw Across the Spider-Verse, which had a couple of really cool iterations of the Spider Woman. And this could have been an opportunity to highlight, you know, some other ones in live action, and they don't. They really don't. It's interesting watching the rest of the movie waiting for this transformation to happen. And by the time you get to the end of the movie, it does not. So all these 3 girls are teenagers at this present moment. So he's seeking out to kill these 3 teenage girls. Meanwhile, Cassandra Webb it gets into an accident where she is trying to save somebody from a falling car, and that goes over a bridge, and she, almost drowns. And this sequence that happens when she's underwater is so batshit crazy. Like, I wish I had the footage. I'll see if I can find some of it to overlay on this if possible, but you have to see it to believe it. There's like spider webs going here and there and flashes of visions of her past and the future and weird animals and stuff. And it comes out of nowhere, really. Like, in the beginning of the movie when the spider people, birth her in this cave, they say, oh, she will seek the answers when she's ready and we'll be ready to answer them. But she wasn't seeking any answers. She just fell off a fucking bridge. So I don't understand why that happened, other than the fact of, we have a movie to make and it's got to keep moving. But after she has this near-death experience, she starts experiencing these intense bouts of deja vu where she will see something very vividly, even feel it at her core, and it hasn't happened yet, and it keeps flashing back and forth, sometimes a little too much. There's times where it's like, all right, come on, let's get it over with here. Let's get it over with. But it's still entertaining in the kind of weird schlocky type of way. Like I said, we're still in the first third of the film at this point. After all this happens, she goes to her partner Ben's sister's baby shower. And the reason I'm saying it all questioningly is because I'm thinking about it. And it's Ben's sister. But if this was also intended to be a Peter Parker origin of sorts, wouldn't it make more sense if that was his sister-in-law? I don't know if maybe they changed lines in post to really distance itself from Spider-Man, but they still have his name being Ben Parker and the baby's parents being Mary and Richard Parker. So why even keep that last name in there? But I digress. They're having a game at the baby shower where the game is to guess the baby's name, which, by the way, I've never heard of anybody at a baby shower playing that. Like, it's almost like the person who wrote that scene had never been to a baby shower. And of course, like, you're expecting it to be revealed like, oh, it's Peter. But Madam Web keeps going through these back and forth, flashbacks, and she's just coming off like really awkward. She starts talking about her dead mom and stuff. And it's these like awkward moments that I think are trying to be played up for comedy's sake, but falling very short because of how they're being delivered and orchestrated. Adds to the overall awkwardness of just the production of the movie in general, to be quite honest. And again, I was having a blast watching this. I was just like, how much more awkwardness can we get out of this movie? It continues where, she's on her way home on the train and she keeps getting these intense, flashbacks. This stuff happens a lot. Like, if y'all complained about how much slow-mo was in Zack Snyder's Justice League, or even if you didn't complain about that, you're gonna complain about how many deja vu moments she has. It's like, okay, we get it. You can see the future. Let's move on. Conveniently enough, all three of the teenage girls are on the train. And I forgot to mention this, but she's interacted with each and every one in some capacity. Like, Sydney Sweeney's character was the sister of a kid that she saved. Isabella Merced is a teenage girl that lives in Webb's apartment. And Celeste O'Connor is just a rude teenager that flipped her off one time in the middle of the road. So that's what connects them, is that what I just said. Webb has this vision of the bad guy showing up and killing all three girls. So she hops into action, says, get off the train or you're gonna die. The dude shows up in like a full black Spider-Man suit, which is also kind of confusing because the suit is so on point Spider-Man, yet this takes place decades before Spider-Man even exists. maybe it was just a coincidence, you know, I don't know, but the spider thing, trying to make it look like a spider. I'm trying to give this movie some sort of credit, but it's not working too much, is it, huh? By the way, if you're enjoying this conversation, please feel free to subscribe. It helps a lot. So she saves their lives, but is accused of kidnapping these girls rather than actually rescuing them. So this leads to this whole, you know, debacle where it's like, oh, well, what about these girls' parents? Like, wouldn't they be looking for them? Again, with the convenience, all three girls do not have present parents. They're all on their own. So that eliminates, you know, any sort of deeper conflict on that part, you know? And that is kind of where the schlock ends. Don't get me wrong, there's still schlocky moments throughout, but in terms of me consistently enjoying having fun with how bad this movie was, that's kind of where it stops in that first third. The second third of the movie is what I like to call just bleh, boring. It's as if, you know, all the plot exposition hasn't been, you know, shoved down our throat already. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but a lot of the dialogue in this film is just exposition. It is just them explaining what's happened in the past, explaining what's happening now, and explaining what's going to happen in the future. So Madam Web is trying to save these girls after learning that she can actually alter the future. You know, she was kind of discouraged because, you know, her the chief of her department died in an accident that she saw and really tried to save him. But not really. She's just kind of like, let me drive. And he's like, no. And then she lets him drive and he dies. But later on, a pigeon like crashes into her window in a vision. And she's like, well, I'm going to open the window and see that the pigeon's still going to die. And he survives. So that gives her a little bit of hope as to being able to save these three girls. So she harbors them and keeps them safe in the middle of the forest. Just leaves them there. And is like, I'm going to be right back. I'm going back to my apartment to look at some spider stuff. And she just ditches them there. And they're like, you know, scrounging for scraps. She didn't leave them with any food or anything. So, of course, they're like, let's just bounce and go to a diner, you know? We'll be back in no time. Meanwhile, while they do that, Madam Web's over at her apartment and she discovers a picture of her mom that has the bad guy in the background. And she puts the pieces together like, oh, this has something to do with me, too. And by the time she gets back to the forest, the girls are already dipped. They made their way to a diner, and some dude recognizes them from the news, calls the police, and then the bad guy's able to trace that call and get to the diner first. Madam Web shows up, has a vision of all the girls dying again, and they have this really lame fight. I think the part that is the best in this movie, though, is the action sequences, because they hardly constitute as action sequences. Most of them are just Madam Web hitting people with her car. She drives her truck into the diner and smashes homeboy. It's funny to watch. It's pretty damn funny. The rest of the movie is just them like, oh, you know what? She's on to something. Maybe we should, band together here. And that's when it starts getting, pretty contrived and pretty boring and pretty basic by the numbers. Like, there's a bunch of stuff with her communicating with the bad guy through some sort of vision thing. They don't really explain that at all. Somehow, I really don't remember this, she ends up back in Peru and talking to the spider guy that helped bring her into the world. And he says some shit. I gotta find this quote. Like, he gives her the typical superhero rundown that you get. Usually in the first third, this comes like right before the last third. What is that? He does the Uncle Ben thing, but he says it horribly. So, the with great power comes great responsibility line. This dude comes out and says, when you take on the responsibility, great power will come. when you take on the responsibility, great power will come. That is such an awkward sentence. What are you talking about? Just say the damn thing. They're really, really trying to distance themselves from Spider-Man while still trying to be connected to Spider-Man. Anyway, now we're in our last third of the movie. You know, the first part was really schlocky. The second part was really boring. The third part is just insulting. This is when my emotions went from I am really enjoying how bad this is to me just feeling insulted, not so much for myself, but for the general population of moviegoers. Because we're already, you know, 2/3 of the way into this movie, and there's no sign of these girls ever, you know, coming into contact with Spider. I'm like, is Madam Web gonna bite him or something? I don't know what's gonna happen. Like, even Madam Web doesn't really have spider powers at all. She can see the future, and you know that is closer to, you know, what happens in the comics, but at least she was like a spider person. Oh man, how do I even explain what happens next? So the girls are staying with Uncle Ben and Peter Parker, not Peter Parker's mom, when she goes into labor. So they're taking off to the hospital. Meanwhile, you know, evil Spider-Man dude finds them somehow because he can do this. He's causing a big old ruckus in the middle of the street, swinging around, jumping around. And also, again, this is a side note, and I don't have any concrete evidence of this, but it always looked to me when they would show the villain, Ezekiel, hopping around, you know, buildings and cars like Spider-Man, it looked like they just used assets from past Spider-Man movies because the build of his body does not match the way he looks when he's not CGI'd. To me, it felt like they were just taking stuff from, you know, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and color correcting the red into black, or even just using the symbiote suit from Spider-Man 3 and adding a few more details to it. I don't have any concrete evidence that that's what they did, but if you see the movie, tell me I'm wrong. They eventually catch up with this dude. He's about to blow them up, and of course, Madam Web comes in and hits him with a car again. This dude can take a fucking pounding, dude. Oh my gosh, the amount of times that he's hit by a car is phenomenal, and just walks away, which I get it. Like, he's got these spider powers and whatnot, but damn, the way that she's able to execute how she's going to get from point A to point B to freaking hit this dude, it's flabbergasting. So eventually they get away, you know, she picks up the girls, you know, leaves Ben to take care of his sister or whatnot. And there's a final fight scene on top of what I'm thinking is a Pepsi Cola factory, because there's a giant Pepsi Cola sign at the top. By the way, I haven't even mentioned this. Pepsi is everywhere in this movie. The product placement in films it's to be expected. You know, movies can't get made without their funding somehow. But the way that Pepsi is presented, like there's a scene early on where she's at the baby shower and she's drinking a Pepsi. I don't know what they did to that Pepsi can, but that thing pops off the screen more than any character in this movie. It is so saturated and so in your face. Thankfully, there's not really any good dialogue being said at that point because your focus is straight on that Pepsi can. So they have this big fight at the end where Madam Web does some web stuff. I don't know. This is the most boring fight scene ever. The best part about it is the end of it, when she finally gets the dude. And yeah, that giant Pepsi sign just falls and crushes him. And that's how he meets his end. Pepsi was actually the true hero of this film, not Madam Web or any of the Spider Women, which, by the way, this is a 2-hour movie where, like, let's just say the hour and 56-minute point, and we still have not gotten any hints of them becoming Spider Women. Somehow she becomes blind. That part I missed. I don't think anything shot her in the eye. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they did. Maybe something did. But she's blind now, which matches, you know, the vibe in the comic. But it's like almost like they were writing the movie and they were like, oh shit, like she's got to go blind at some point, and just fit that in. So the girls all surround her. You see her in the hospital. Ben's sister's baby is born. And we still never learn the baby's name, meaning that that whole scene of the baby shower where they're guessing the name is incredibly pointless. And even just further proof that Sony watched this and was like, we're not doing this. Because initially I've read that the intention was for this film to be set in the 90s, and the Peter Parker in the film would be Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker from the Amazing Spider-Man films. Then later on, after seeing the movie, Sony was like, actually, let's change it to 2003, add a few more references to the year throughout the film. Like there's a giant Beyonce Dangerously in Love poster. The girls have a dance scene where they're dancing to Toxic by Britney Spears, and make it Tom Holland's Spider-Man. And then I guess they were like, no Spider-Man, no. Which, again, I will give them credit for knowing when to pull back. It's not like they did with Morbius, where they threw in that half-assed post-credit scene where Vulture shows up for no reason. They took that scene out. Like in the first weekend, that scene was there. And then after a few weeks, they took it out. And I don't even think it's on the home video release or anything like that. I don't think it's on streaming or anything like that. So they caught themselves early here. Eventually, Madam Web recuperates. She's blind and in a wheelchair like she is in the comics. And the girls go visit her one last time at the end of the movie, and she's like, I see great things in your future. And that is when we start to see them in the spider suits. This is all a hypothetical situation based on what she can see in the future. And that's the thing, is like, I get it. They're probably hyping this up for like, ooh, come back in Madam Web 2 where these girls get their powers. There's not going to be no Madam Web 2. Get the fuck out of here. Essentially, that means that the trailer that you showed us was a trailer for a movie that does not exist. And that is where I felt insulted. I was like, really? I would have taken 5 minutes of screen time. Hell, even Fantastic. Remember that movie? People were mad that the Fantastic Four were hardly in it. The level of screen time that they had was monumental compared to something like this. And the other thing is, in the movie, like I explained earlier with her, being able to see that not everything in the future stays the same, so could be the case with these Spider Women. Like, even though she's having this vision now of them in these cool suits, swinging around, fighting crime, that's still not a guarantee that in this universe that will ever happen. It's still a hypothetical, because we never even get a lot of the prophecies that she sees or that anybody sees. Like, that's the thing too. Like the dude in the beginning, seeing the prophecy of the girls killing him. That didn't happen. Her seeing a bunch of the girls getting killed. That didn't happen. So what's to say that all these girls becoming Spider Women isn't gonna happen? So you're showing us this thing that's essentially an elevated fantasy and portraying it as, no, this is the movie that you're gonna see today. And it's not. And that is where the final insult lied. And I walked out of the theater mind blown for all the wrong reasons. This was such a mixed bag, and yet I still have to admit I had an absolute blast watching it for those reasons. It's something that is so messy, so sloppy, and coming from a company that really has bangers. Like Columbia Pictures, in the beginning of the movie, they're hyping up that this is the 100-year anniversary of this company, one of the leaders in entertainment for a century now. And this is what we're doing here? It's fascinating to me. As a moviegoer, as someone who's loved comic book films since he was little, somebody who's followed almost every Marvel theatrical film, whether it be from Marvel Studios or one of these offshoots, like, yeah, we've had some stinkers, like, let's not sell ourselves short, but I don't know if I've seen any of them be as entertaining, as boring, and as insulting as this all at the same time. And I'm not going to talk about these actors' performances. It's not their fault. It really isn't. When you hear the dialogue that's being said, I don't even know if Meryl Streep could pull this off. And it's so entertaining for that reason. And I know that might be confusing to some of you. You're saying like, oh, it's bad, but it's entertaining. Yes, it's easy to come across a movie that's boring and forgettable and still bad. It's rare to find a movie that's bad, boring, but still I'm never going to forget this movie. Like, this made a lasting impression. I wish I had more footage to show you. Like, you're going to have to see it yourself. And if you don't want to support them, that's fine. Maybe wait till it comes on streaming. It's still supporting them, but, you know, at a lower cost to you. I can see, you know, future bad movie screenings of this happening. You know, roast screening, something like The Room, something like a Neil Breen film. Like, this is iconic for all the wrong reasons, but so right if you are a fan of schlocky B cinema. Like, I'm even hesitant to call this a B movie because I've seen B movies that are actually trying to tell a story. Hell, even The Room has intent behind it. This just felt corporate and lazy and so out of tune with whoever they thought the audience was for this. And it should be studied. This is a film that needs to be taken seriously in film courses, especially at this very fragile time in cinema where event films are, you know, far and few between, you know. Back, you know, even a couple years ago, every summer, every week, there would be some sort of event film. Now, post-pandemic, we rarely ever get those, you know? And the fact that this is kind of masquerading almost as an event film, it's kind of scary for what is happening with these major studios. I think that there needs to be, you know, some new blood coming in and just injecting new life into these properties. I'm not saying like, hey, let's stop making remakes and IP related stuff. No, that's fine. We've seen with, of course, Barbie that you can take an IP and make something brilliant and genius out of it. Something that shouldn't work. The Lego movie is another prime example. Hell, even a lot of Marvel studio films, say what you want about Marvel, they are enjoyable films. Especially like the pre-Endgame era ones. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating case study. It's funny for all the wrong reasons. It's boring, but still intriguing and insulting, but they have my respect to an extent. I don't know if anything I've said today makes sense to any of you. Please let me know in the comments. But again, I'm Nostaljock. Thank you for watching me rant about why I liked Madam Web so much. It might have seemed like it didn't. Like, I'm sorry if y'all were expecting me to gush over this film like it was the greatest thing ever based on the title of this video. But I still did have a blast. I did have a blast watching this. I love a good, bad movie. And this checked off most of those boxes for me. I think it could have, if it would have leaned into the schlock a little bit more from that first third, this would have been iconic. This would have been a classic. I can't really guarantee that I would see this again unless it was at a screening like that. I think that would be a lot of fun. But if you're looking for some cheap laughs, you know, take your friends, have a few drinks, toke up. You do you. You're going to have a blast like I did. Peace.